Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And for Mr. Schiefelbein, I thought you were right to bring up the Phoenix meeting because it gave us a sense of what are the consensus items for the marketplace. I think in your testimony you alluded to the fact that sometimes because the cattle industry can't agree, we don't get as much done as we should. And there are some consensus items. The Phoenix meeting had three areas of agreement. Number one, the importance of transparency. We've made progress on that with the Cattle Contract Library. Also about adding capacity. The Butcher Block Act has made progress. But then three, critically important, oversight, which you mentioned. And I don't know that we've made progress on that front. You mentioned that enforcement is important. Of course, I agree with you. So a little thought exercise for you, sir. Let's say the president calls you, says that you're going to be the next head of packers and stockyards. I mean, give us a sense of what is your vision for the agency. How do we do it better? And what is your advice to Congress about what tools we can give you as the head of the agency to do a better job?
Yeah, and to me, it's all about enforcement. And I don't know if the funding's not there. I don't know the intricacies, to be quite honest. But to me, the laws are in the books. We just need to make sure enforcement is occurring. And knowledge is also power. If we knew what was occurring and why it occurred, if it occurred, it would be so helpful to my membership, right? They're demanding answers. They're saying, our lives are on the line here, okay? Our lives depend on fair markets. How come we can't get answers on what has happened and what has transpired and where we are today? So that's the push I would get is there's a lot of movement towards adding a new agency, a new oversight agency. But the reality is from a government standpoint, why don't you get the one that you got working first? That's my dad's thought process. Fix the tractor that you have before you buy another tractor.
Mr. Johnson, would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
I think this is a very good question, and with your experience over the years, how would you say enforcement has changed one way or the other over the last 3 decades? You go back to your father and your grandfather. Has it gotten more enforcement, less enforcement? Have you noticed?
And again, I look older than I am, so I'm actually not that big of a span of ages. But the reality, I believe, is that it just seems like the wheels of the Department of Justice have gotten slower and slower and slower. Now, maybe that is just my perspective, but it seems, I understand justice takes time, but the progress is so slow that you cannot have a system in place to protect people if the timing on the process can put them out of business. And that's what I'm getting at.
And reclaiming my time, I think that's exactly right. And for me, we talk about transparency and transparency in the marketplace. I think it would be helpful to have some transparency within the government as well. I think we all understand the rationale of why they don't release a report if they haven't found any wrongdoing. But that silence is not good for the producer. It's not good for the consumer. I would submit it's not good for the packer. It makes everybody think something's going on behind the veil. So when we talk about, you mentioned earlier that we haven't heard boo or squat, which is exactly the right phrase, sir.
Sorry.
About the investigations in the wake of the Holcomb fire and COVID. I mean, let's set this information free. It seems to me that that is one key thing we could do to bring a higher level of understanding to what's going on from an enforcement perspective and tell those of us in this room maybe what we could be helping the DOJ do better with regard to enforcement. I'll give you an opportunity to react.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to a pretty simple principle you learn raising kids, right? The boogeyman disappears when you turn the light on, right? And there's a boogeyman out there. We don't know if it's real or not real because the light's off. We need the light flipped back on to know whether or not the boogeyman exists.
Anything else, Mr. Costa, before I yield back?
No, I thank the gentleman for his good questions always.
Sounds good. Well, thank you. I think you're exactly right. Let's turn the light on. That's something I think we could find robust bipartisan agreement on. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And too often it seems like congressional attention is drawn to the brightest light, I suppose like moths to the flame. And so it wasn't that surprising that in April 2020, when cattle prices bottomed out and when people couldn't get the steak they wanted at their meat counter, then, lo and behold, all of a sudden, everybody, including the city folk, had their attention on this space. They began to understand the weaknesses in the supply chain. I think they began to appreciate the deficiencies in the cattle market. At that time, members across this body understood that this stuff matters. And in that environment, we were able to get real progress done on my cattle contract library and on the Spanberger-Johnson Butcher Block Act. But this stuff matters, Mr. Chairman, all the time. As you so often say, we cannot do without food. And that means we can't let attention just drift away because we've had a bit of a rally on the fed cattle prices. We can't afford to let our attention drift away just because we are between black swan events. In our earlier panel today, we talked a lot about marketplace concentration. We talked about efficiency, and we talked about a choke point at a particular part of the supply chain. That is the meat processing part of the supply chain, the part that our witnesses today in this panel can speak to. And as I think about that, we talk a lot about the Big Four, and that's appropriate. But I think we also want to talk about the Big 30 or the Big 12. What do I mean by that? Well, between 85 and 90% of the beef processing in this country is done at just 30 plants, just 30 physical locations. And in fact, 12 plants do more than half of all the beef processing. To me, that seems like a lot of vulnerability. That seems like a lot of eggs in a very small number of baskets. Because when black swan events happen, whether they're cybersecurity or they are the Holcomb fire or they are COVID, we know that when those black swan events attack that choke point, that hurts producers, that hurts consumers. We know another black swan event is coming. Whatever it is. I don't know what it is and I don't know when it's going to be, but we know it's coming. And so here's why I'm going to tell you what I think, gentlemen, and you can tell me what you think. I think that this drive for efficiency has left our country with too little slack, with too little cushion. I think this tightness leaves us exposed to unforeseen disruptions, and that creates a lot of risk, a lot of vulnerability to the American cattle producer. So my questions, and we can start with Mr. Shellpepper from JBS. You know, number one, am I wrong about that vulnerability, about that risk? And number two, if unfortunately I'm right, what do we do about it?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I'll speak to JBS. So we operate 9 plants across the United States. We operate some very large plants. We operate some very large plants. We operate plants in very different parts of the country, with a network of buyers to buy those cattle and a distribution network that frankly is very robust. So from my perspective, and I can only speak for the JBS business, I think our model offers a degree of resiliency already.
And I don't know, and I'm not insinuating that all of the cost of additional cushion within the system should be borne by any particular set of shareholders. But it seems to me that when we say that, you know, one company or the marketplace has enough cushion that you think you're diverse enough, I mean, we just don't see that. Right, sir? I mean, when we have one issue attack one plant, don't we see massive price swings to both the producers and the consumers? What am I getting wrong here?
Well, from a market standpoint, I mean, what's happened over the last couple of years is well documented. And again, I go back to, as we went through COVID, we had a number of goals in our company, and one of them was recognizing and taking on the responsibility of our role in the food supply. And that doesn't end with COVID. That we carry that forward with us every single day. So whether that's things that we should be doing inside of our facilities, whether that's other risk mitigation strategies that we should have, we continually work on those, even today.
Well, thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I would just close by noting this. I mean, I don't think everything's okay. I do think we have a vulnerability in the American food supply system that I know we can work in a bipartisan way to address. But the Big 12, the Big 30, the Big 4, this is a problem for the availability and security of American food. Thank you.